All right, so this is going to be the last video in our series reviewing Module 1B or Chapter 2 of your text, which provides an introduction to cognitive neuroscience. And in this particular video, I'm going to talk about a concept known as distributed representation. So in my previous two videos, I talked about something called specialization of function or localization of function at both the level of individual neurons and brain structures. So essentially what I argued is that there's a lot of evidence that we can actually pinpoint specific types of neurons and specific structures in the brain that represent various aspects of cognition from a neuronal perspective or a neural perspective, right? So essentially I was telling you where in the brain certain processes are activated, right? But for most of the complex cognitions that we are capable of as human beings, we can't pinpoint a single area of the brain or a single neural structure. Instead, we have to talk about numerous areas of the brain that operate in concert or operate together, right? So this is the notion of distributed representation, which says that for most types of complex cognition, multiple areas of the brain or multiple neural mechanisms are implicated, right? So anytime we have any sort of complex cognitions, be they perceptions from looking at something or processes such as remembering or thinking, these processes are going to activate numerous, sometimes widely separated areas of the brain, right? So now I'm going to work through several different examples that demonstrate this idea of distributed representation. Okay, so our first example. In my last video, I talked about a region of the temporal lobe known as the FFA. Right? So the FFA stands for fusiform face area. And for many years, it was believed to be an area of the brain that specialized in recognizing faces. Now, I told you about more recent research suggesting that it doesn't just process or recognize faces, but it also allows for recognition of really any visual stimuli that you have some degree of expertise in. But what's relevant to consider in this case is the fact that facial processing is going to require a lot more than simply just recognizing that the blob in front of you, right, the random blob in front of you is a face, right? So registering something as a face is important, but it's not all you're doing whenever you see a face in front of you, right? So faces are multidimensional in that they have a number of different qualities, and you have to appraise those qualities and integrate them simultaneously, right? So looking at a face is going to trigger many different aspects of that face. So in addition to identifying that an object is a face, right, we also have to respond to many different aspects, right? For example, there are emotional aspects. So maybe you notice that someone is smiling, right? And based on that information, you assume or you infer that that person is happy. And maybe looking at their happy face also sort of evokes happy feelings in yourself, right? So those are emotional aspects. There's also, when you're looking at a face, an awareness of the direction of someone's gaze, right? So by following where someone is fixating their eyes as you're looking at them, you know, are they looking at me? Are they looking, are they looking up at something? Are they looking behind them? And so on. And that provides information. You are also at sort of an implicit level evaluating the person's attractiveness, right? And you're probably doing this on the basis of facial symmetry, which is a predictor of one's general health, and it's something that we have evolved to pay attention to, and it's very much integrated into our notion of beauty, is how symmetrical someone's face is. Okay, so you're simultaneously identifying something as a face with the FFA, you're looking at the direction of their gaze, you are evaluating their attractiveness, and so on. So you're integrating all of those features together, and each of those separate aspects are going to be evaluated by a different region of the brain, operating together, right? Or representing various aspects of that face at the same time. Okay, we see the same sort of multi-dimensional representation with memory, right? So basically, since taking intro psych, most of you, I'm sure, remember that new memories are created in a structure of the temporal lobe called the hippocampus, right? And that is true, right? But memories are, again, multifaceted. They include multiple components. So we can talk about visual memories that are evoked whenever you picture some place that you've been to before or conjure up a mental image in your mind of that place. They can be auditory, such as when you remember what someone has said to you in the past, or maybe you remember a favorite song. And also one of the most powerful senses that is evocative in terms of generating very, very rich, detailed memories is your sense of smell, right? So olfactory stimulation can prompt you to remember all kinds of things, right? So all of these basic sensory modalities are going to be triggered whenever you conjure up a memory. Okay. Similarly, we talked extensively about Broca's area and Wernicke's area as being established as the speech production and speech comprehension centers of the brain. But more recent research seems to call that assertion into question, right? So why are we now sort of skeptical of that claim? Well, more contemporary research has shown that you can sustain damage to other regions of the brain, and that damage will result in language processing and production difficulties as well, right? So for example, you can sustain damage to your parietal lobe and still have significant difficulty with speech comprehension and speech production. There's also a lot of evidence that Broca's area isn't just singularly involved in speech production. It's also responsible for a lot of different kinds of motor learning. So for example, recent experiments have shown that whenever we grasp or manipulate something with our hands, this area of the frontal lobe is also activated. And also, if you show participants kind of ambiguous hand shapes that kind of look like animals, almost like shadow puppets, right? This area of the frontal lobe, Broca's area, is activated. So in addition to speech production, this area seems to be involved in being able to predict or process other people's actions, other people's motor actions. And Relatedly, it seems that language is actually processed in numerous regions of the brain, and they're all activated simultaneously. So we've actually seen different pathways that become activated depending on what aspects of language you are paying attention to. Right? So for example, that pathway in blue is activated whenever you process phonetic information. So information related to sound or production of speech, okay? All of those areas are going to be activated simultaneously. Similarly, all of the areas indicated by the red line are simultaneously activated during speech comprehension. And both the blue pathway and the red pathway are activated when we're trying to engage in basic sentence comprehension, right? So all of that is to say is that processing of language is so complex and multifaceted that it's going to require multiple regions of the cortex, which is the most sort of advanced or most recently evolved area of the brain, and to pinpoint language comprehension and speech production just to those individual areas is both incorrect and misleading. And it also discounts the fact that both of those areas of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe are implicated in a lot of other processes besides speech production and speech comprehension. Okay, so another example that illustrates distributed representation in the brain is basic visual perception of just ordinary stimuli. Right? So your book gives you a hypothetical example of a man watching a red ball rolling across a table, right? Simply perceiving that event, not interacting with that ball at all, just to see the ball in front of him as it moves. Different regions of the brain, different structures of the brain are going to code for various aspects. So, for example, the location of the ball, depth perception, indicating the motion, color, and shape of the ball, all of those basic perceptual properties are going to be represented, again, by different areas of that cortex, or that most recently evolved area of the brain. We see another example in perception of pain. Right? So pain is another example of a multifaceted phenomenon. Anytime we experience a painful stimulus, obviously we're going to experience sensory stimulation depending upon the nature of the pain, right? So whatever sensory modalities are implicated by this painful stimulus, you know, if you stick your hand in a bucket of ice, okay, obviously the areas of the cortex that are responsible for allowing you to detect that stimulus are first going to register that pain. But there's also a very significant emotional or cognitive aspect to pain, right? So for example, your amygdala is going to become activated in response to the fear and anxiety that you experience, and also your desire to avoid that painful stimulus. Obviously, your hippocampus is going to activate any prior traumatic memories where you have experienced similar sorts of pain, right? Your hypothalamus is going to respond as the various systems of your brain change in response to that temperature change. So obviously if you put your hand in a bucket of ice water, right, then you're going to register a much cooler temperature than you were before, etc. So all of that is to say that pain perception is going to, again, activate many different regions of the brain in response to the cognitive processes that are triggered by that painful stimulus. Okay, so the very last example I wanted to show you is, again, examples of situations where multiple brain regions are activated when you're involved in a single cognitive process, or when a single cognitive process is being carried out, right? So using something called functional connectivity, we can put people in a brain scanner while they're engaging in various tasks, various cognitive tasks, and we can see, or we can measure, the extent to which activations in multiple brain regions are correlated, right? So if activation in multiple brain regions are correlated, that would again be evidence that rather than isolating this particular cognitive process to a single brain region, we can talk about multiple brain regions being activated at the same time and being implicated in that process. Okay, so I'm going to show you using this diagram. I realize it's sort of hard to see, but they've identified several different areas of networks that are areas of the brain that are simultaneously activated in a single cognitive process, right? So the first is the case with visual perception, right? So I told you guys that the visual cortex is in the occipital lobe, and that's where a lot of visual perception happens. But there are also other sort of surrounding areas, like the temporal lobe, for example, and the parietal lobe, that are also responsible for visual processing. Similarly, anytime that we are processing tactile information or information related to movement, we see with the somatomotor cortex that multiple regions of the brain are going to become activated. Again, we see the parietal lobes and the temporal lobes being activated there. And anytime we pay attention to visual spatial information, that's going to activate the dorsal attentional network. And you can see, again, we have widespread activation there with different areas of the brain showing increased activation, even though they're fairly far apart from each other, or fairly spread out. And one of the other networks that we're going to be talking about extensively, or one of the other aspects of cognition that we're going to be talking about extensively, particularly in Module 2 when we talk about working memory, is the notion of executive control. Right? So executive control is kind of an attentional process. So executive control allows you to pay attention to one stimulus or event while simultaneously filtering out all other stimuli. And it also helps you select one response while sort of suppressing or inhibiting another response. And it's going to be very, very important for complex cognition, right? So you see executive control, again, is going to activate numerous regions of the brain, including the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe and parts of the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe and parts of the parietal lobe. And again, anytime that we are processing meaningful information, particularly information that is going to be relevant to our survival, as in salience, there's going to be multiple regions activated. And also, anytime that we're engaging in activities that would make us aware of autobiographical information, so significant events in our lives, and anytime that we monitor our current emotional state and engage in something called metacognition, we're going to activate something called the default network, right? So we'll talk about all of these individual areas of complex cognition later in the course, but what you should attend to again is when we look at patterns of brain activation, instead of isolating this type of cognition to a particular region of the brain, we see widespread activation, and not just widespread activation, but widespread activation that occurs concurrently or at the same time, right? So what that suggests is that for most human cognition, right, rather than talking about a singular area of the brain as being the neural substrate or area of neural representation, right? We're going to have to talk about multiple areas of the brain acting together or acting in concert. Okay? All right, so that concludes our Module 1B videos. So I will see you in Module 2A in our next playlist. All right, have a good day.